think I'd like to at least be able to see some of the faces. So is that just gallery view? I guess I'm not going to worry about it because I want to start my presentation. But thank you so much for joining me. I'm actually doing a series of these for African American History Month and Women's History Month, and try to do them all year round. And I'm actually trying to do a few different kinds of presentations. I'm doing one called "Taking the Struggle into the Streets." Black Lives Always Mattered, and just trying to work with my archives and do different things with my work. Okay, so I want to get onto the page and I want to go into my uh, slideshow. Yes, okay, here we go. Okay, so this is a presentation that I put together actually a number of years ago, and I call it Retrospective Spirit of a People. And as a photographer, I usually photograph people of African American descent or African descent or Caribbean descent or Caribbean, descent. Um, and I guess that's really because that's where my family is from. My family's from Guyana. And you grow up with certain traditions and you grow up in certain neighborhoods, and then you just, start photographing who are around you. Uh, so I start off with my family. I start off with my dad. He was a portrait artist, and I took this photograph of him in New York City circuit the 80s. Probably if I really look into my archives and into my files, I'll find the negative and I'll find the exact year that I photographed him. He passed in 1993, but what is really special about having an artist in your family is that they really, I would say, kind of help you along. And when he knew I was interested in going to RIT, he and my mom actually chipped in money to help me buy a darkroom. My mom was also an artist, as well as a homemaker,
Hey, Colette.
and she was a designer. Yes.
Colette, I'm sorry. Your pictures are not up. I
Oh
think you
dear.
need to share your screen.
Okay, that would help. All right, so let me just go back to the beginning. I'm gonna have to escape it. Let me go into Zoom and share my screen. Okay. Okay, just bear with me. My apologies. Okay, here we go.
Okay, you're good.
We're good? Okay. So let me go back into my slideshow. Okay, here we go. Thank you.
That's perfect.
That would have been a disaster. Thank you. All right, so I started talking about my dad, who was a portrait artist and just really an all around fun guy. Grew up in Detroit, and his family was from Texas and Appaloosa, Louisiana. Who really kind of, I guess I could say, he really encouraged me to go into photography once I told him I was interested. And actually, he used to use a lot of photographic equipment in doing his paintings and his and portraits. So I mentioned also my mom was a clothing designer. She was a Rosie the Riveter and also a homemaker. She had 5 children and a set of twins in between the 5 children. She was married twice. And what's kind of special about my dad, before he passed, he did a videotape. He was interviewed and he did a videotape at the Restoration in Brooklyn. And that was again before he passed in 1993. So most of this is that what I'm showing you is I'm trying to be as sequential as possible, but in some cases I do kind of jump around a little bit. So this is a photograph I took of Jamaica Run in 1972. At that point, I was in my second year of photographic studies at RIT. And I really thought I was a good math major and science major, but RIT really did kick my butt. I have to say realistically, it was a very, very tough program. Um, and I appreciate it. I appreciate it more and more, the technical education that I received, partially because it's something that I could share with my students and understand enough not to overwhelm them, but just kind of give them sort of a general, understanding as to film emulsions and digital information. And, of course, that was our time in the 70s. We weren't even really thinking about digital photography. So what was important about 1972 was that my mom took each of us to Jamaica, West Indies. And why she didn't take us to Guyana, I don't know. But Jamaica was really a hot time, at that point. People were buying property there, and she was kind of interested in that. And my brother had gone to school in, I think it's Westmoreland area of Jamaica. So, it was really hot. Bob Marley was around. There's a lot of reggae and ska, and, everybody wanted to just sort of go to Jamaica. So she took me to Jamaica for this week trip, a week long trip. And, because I was a teenager, maybe like 19, 20 at that time, she wouldn't let me just go explore by myself. She said, "Oh, no, you're not getting away. You're not going to do that." But anyway, so with this yearning to have been there after being there just for a week, I definitely wanted to go back. So I got a grant to go to Jamaica in 1982. It was a 6-week grant, and with an additional 2 weeks going to Martinique, Fort-de-France, Martinique, to visit my dear friend Alice. And this is her here, Alice Momarche, who was a girlfriend from elementary school. It was her mom. And my girlfriend, who turned out to be an attorney, did not like flying. So she talked me into going to Martinique to visit her mom. And, it was another opportunity to make images. So let's see, let me go on to the next one. So in 1983, I had another opportunity to go to Jamaica for a much shorter time and photograph, was very interested in Rastafari movement, and had a chance to go to an actual Rastafarian conference, which is where I made this particular image. So not all photographers do their own printing, do their own processing. In the newspaper business, we used to process our film, but depending upon the paper where you were at, they actually had a lab assistant to do the printing. But for my personal work, I did all my processing, all my printing. I tried to, in some cases, mix developers and kind of play around. But what I should say is that the 1982 and 1983 journeys, I was preparing for a show at the Rochester Eisenhart Museum Gallery, Rochester Museum and Science Center. So that was going to be my first one-woman show, and that was in 1984. So in 1983, so I'm going back a little bit, I started working for actually 19 late 70s. I actually was working in television for a couple of years. I went to a second Fox affiliate, editing film and being a production assistant. And in 1983, I got a job with About Time magazine, which really suited me fine. It was a monthly publication, and they really let me do my own projects, which is kind of special about a monthly publication. The deadlines aren't tight like a weekly or a daily paper. But I met a very extraordinary gentleman by the name of Adolphe Dupree, and he was one of the top feature writers for About Time magazine. Really brilliant gentleman from Buffalo, New York. And he said to me, he says, we need to collaborate on a project. And I love collaboration. He just said the magic words. So he told me about growing up in Buffalo and the fact that there were these motorcycle clubs in Buffalo and Rochester, and we should start to talk to them. So anyway, we did this huge project called The Ripple of Thunder, which is actually part of Photoville right now, the ninth edition of Photoville, which is a traveling show. So I had about 5 or 6 images, and I love portraiture. It's very possible I got that from my dad, but I really, really love the face. I love lighting the face and really kind of, playing around with different tones. And this is just kind of a transitional photograph, traveling back and forth from Rochester to New York City to my home in New York City. I took the bus a lot before I discovered the train, and I photographed this lady on a bus. This was in the 1980s, and it just kind of felt like it had sort of a Jim Crow type of feel to me. So anyway, I photographed it. I manipulated a little bit in the darkroom. I kind of played with wax paper to soften up her skin tone just a little bit, which is why it has a different look to it. So now I'm really jumping ahead. It's 1993, and I'm at Rockland Community College, and I'm sort of talked into curating this show. And the show is called There's a World Through Our Eyes, Perceptions and Visions of the African American Photographer. And it was a show of 25 African American photographers, 5 lithographers, and a sculptor. And it was a very, very tough year. We had to write grants to help with programming. I just spoke to Albert Chong earlier today because he sent me some information, and he was part of the show. And I was recalling to him or recounting to him about There's a World show Through Our Eyes. And it was a multi-sided show, 5 different exhibition sites. And each site had a different theme. And then the big show that represented everyone's work was, of course I'm forgetting, but it was at Blue Hill in Rockland County. So the show was cataloged. This is a copy of the catalog, which is actually available for $5 on Amazon. I am so impressed by that. Okay. This is a photograph that I just love to share. It's of my collective Kamoinge, and I've been a member since 2001. And you might recognize, at least for photographers, you might recognize some of the people in Kamoinge. And some of the people within the frames are people who have passed or people who are no longer active with the organization. But it's very interesting being part of a collective. I highly recommend it, and you really do get to be like family, which means that there might be like a little controversy sometime, which is good, which is good. I think the important thing about it is that we've had a lot of shows, a lot of exhibitions. We've really put Black photographers sort of on the map, and especially because the earlier group was doing their thing since 1963. And I love the stories where Lou Draper and Sean Walker and Tony Barboza were all hanging out together, learning how to print, and had the darkroom enlarger on the floor trying to figure out how to print. Oh, amazing. Okay. When I was at RIT, I started to play around. We had this thing called the cage, and it was just a space where we can borrow all sorts of photographic equipment. And I started to play around with this Kodak Retina. And of course, I was shooting slide film, which I used to process myself. E6 was the process at the time. I think previous to that, I think it was either E3 and E4. But by the time it got to E6, it was an easier process. So I used to process my slides. But I got into this rhythm of where I was photographing musicians and dancers. In this case, this is Garth Fagan Dance Company. And I got into this rhythm where I was really playing around with shutter speeds, and I really just loved it. I wasted so much film, because what happens is when you're shooting in a very slow shutter, which is what we call dragging the shutter, you tend to overexpose a whole lot. So I wasted a lot of film, but it was a fun project. And I also used to photograph musicians using that same kind of formula. This is a photograph that I took in July of 1998. And it was very special to me because it was a tribute to John Henrik Clark, who had just passed. I photographed this on my birthday, and I brought my cameras to work that day. And I told my supervisor, listen, I have to leave like at 3 o'clock or 12 o'clock, whatever time it was. And I think I drove down to the city because usually if I have equipment, I'm going to be driving. And I'm a little claustrophobic, you know, which I think a lot of people will understand. And so I decided not to go into the Abyssinian Baptist Church, which is where the his memorial service was being held, his funeral was being held. But I said, you know, I'm just going to kind of hang on the outside and see what I see what images I can make on the outside. And this is one of the images that I made and, you know, processed and printed. And what's special about it for me as well is that about maybe 3, 4 years ago, I started playing the djembe with Chico Wali, African dance and culture. So, so it's just really cool. It's just interesting how things just kind of come circling your life. All right, so this is 19. I'm afraid to move this little thing. I better not. Okay, so this is 1991, the end of 1991, and what was going on in 1990, the Bergen Record, who had hired me in the late 80s, started laying people off. So I was there like 2 years, and I was able to get past the first amount of layoffs. And by the third year, I was gone. And that was a very traumatic experience because I bought like a little co-op in Spring Valley, New York, and you know, and I was living my life and they were giving you like a company car. And it really taught me a very good lesson. First of all, it taught me, I mean, it's funny now, but it wasn't funny then. But one of the things that it taught me is that as a photographer, you always have to be ready. You always have to have your own equipment, your own lights, cameras, camera bags, accessories, tripods, monopods. You have your flashes. You always have to be ready because you never know, especially if you're working for someone. And a friend of mine at the time, Clarence Davis, who was a photojournalist for the Daily News, longtime photojournalist for the Daily News, told me about the job, told me about the opening at the Bergen Record, and said, "Oh, Clit, you can't stay at the Journal News forever. You got to move on. You got to move on." So, like, you know, I'm saying, okay, well, I guess that kind of makes sense. But the interesting thing is, I kept saying to myself, if something happens with this job at the Bergen Record, which was a one-family paper, versus being at Gannett, which had papers all over the world, I said, I'm sunk. Anyway, I had a dear friend, Stella Mars, and I'd met her when I was shooting for the Journal News. And she says, "Oh, why don't you go up to the college and I'll introduce you to a few people up there." So I ended up getting a job. But anyway, relative to this photograph, the Haitian rally, why this was important was that I said, no matter what, I have to keep my portfolio going. So I photographed this this image in 1991. Uh-oh. This is marching for Ossie Davis in February of 2005 when he passed. And you know, it's an interesting thing that what happens with digital. So at this point, I'm just switching over from analog photography into digital photography. And what happens with digital photography, it does not like highlights. I don't care what you do, it does not like highlights. And so we have what we call like a broad lighting ratio. So, you know, I'm sort of working with the crowd and I see I think it's a woman, it could be a guy, but I see the long dreads and the lines and the composition. And I'm just in sort of like the spirit of the thing. And I saw that white and I said, oh, that's really going to give me a problem. So I tried to get my exposure really in here. But again, digital does not like highlights. So, but anyway, it was important for me to be at Ossie Davis's funeral. Another thing I'd like to share is that the Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee family once sent me a congratulatory note when I completed my MFA from Vermont College in 2003, and that was just so special. It seemed to me that I met Ruby Dee when I was working for About Time magazine in Rochester, New York. I can't remember 100%, but I think that's where I knew her, or at least met her, crossed paths with her, and probably, photographed her. This is going back a few years. This is 1983, so it's 20 years since the March on Washington. And I talked my editor and the publisher, Jim Blount, into us going to Washington, D.C. to photograph the March on Washington 20 years later. And the march had a strange vibe to it. I didn't really feel it was a very successful shoot. I was carrying too much equipment, and we were sort of driving all night to get to DC from Rochester, which is a horrific trip. But anyway, so one of the things I thought about, I said, well, let me focus on the children, and I made this image with that thought in mind. This is June 16th, 2012, and it was an NAACP trip to the Harriet Tubman Museum in Auburn, New York. And what was very special about this trip, first of all, this is, oh my goodness, just sometimes, your memory does a thing to you. But this is Willie Trotman, so he's head of the NAACP. And this young lady is Celestine, Miss Celestine is her name. And she was the head of the NAACP Youth Bureau. And I'm a lifetime member of the NAACP. And it makes me so proud. We're the Spring Valley branch. We also have a branch in Nyack, and occasionally we get together and do things together. But it really makes me feel proud to see the work that we're doing with the NAACP, and especially Willie Trotman, who is from Florida and keeps saying he's coming back to Northern Florida to spend time with his brothers, but all he does is stay in Rockland County and fight for the rights of African American people. So my hat is always off to him. Now this was an interesting project. This is Willie Trotman again on the left, and Frances Pratt, NAACP president for Nyack, who's very famous for her beautiful, beautiful hats that her late husband made her. And we were doing a project. We were doing an exhibition curated by one of my former students and very close friend, Ken Karlowitz. And that was to be exhibited at the Garnerville Arts Center. So I wanted to photograph the two of them together to just kind of symbolize their unity, and everything was going to be photographed on Main Street, or really the Route 9W and Route 59. Route 59 is the longest street that runs through Rockland County. So it runs from Suffern all the way to at least Nyack, and it transverses the thruway. So it was like the major street before the thruway was built. And I'm very interested in Underground Railroad sites. I'm very interested in African American history, trying to cram as much and do as much reading as I can and research. And I came upon this particular scene. I was actually here twice, but this was an actual Underground Railroad site in Sugarloaf, New York. And I photographed this in August 2009. This was for the Bergen Record, and I had to carry lights and set up lighting to photograph it. The young lady, she and her family lived in Teaneck, New Jersey, and they set up a whole scene for us. And unfortunately, the paper ran such a beautiful photograph in black and white, and that happened often. So there was really nothing we could do about that. But anyway, it was an opportunity to, show a picture, have a picture of Kwanzaa in my collection. This is the Me and Women March, Philadelphia, October 25th, 1997. And it was organized 2 years after the 1995 historic Million Man March held in Washington, D.C. And I may have mentioned I'm a little claustrophobic. So, so, you just deal with it. I mean, if it happens, you just sort of deal with it. But fortunately, because I had press credentials, I was able to get up on a high area that they had for the press and made this image. And I thought it was important to include the "I'm one in a million" sign in the corner. And these are children from the Million Women's March in Philadelphia. Ran into a couple of my colleagues there. One was Salima Ali, who's in Kamonge. This lady is a very, very powerful lady that if you know anything about African American history or culture, you should know her. She is Dr. Joy DeGruy. She was Joy Larry. She grew up in California. I believe she's originally from Louisiana. So she might even be one of my cousins, I'm not sure, but she did these studies on post-traumatic slave syndrome. And this was a lecture at NAACP dinner. So it was probably NAACP NIAC, I believe, or it could have been the two organizations collaborating. But she became kind of one of my heroes, especially because I was undoing racism work with a lot of friends of mine in Rockland County. Many of them were mental health therapists. But I'm just going to read you her background just a little bit because she is such a dynamic woman. But she holds a Bachelor of Science degree in communications. Dr. Larry or Dr. DeGruy has 2 master's degrees in social work and clinical psychology and a PhD in social work research. And it was just important every time she would give a lecture, whether it be in the tri-state area, I would just really try to go listen to her. And also WBAI has featured a lot of her lectures. This is a photograph. It's actually vertical. The original is vertical. It's of Reverend Dr. Calvin Butts, the Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street in Harlem. And he is talking about pushing cigarettes off on our children and the various ads that you find in African American communities, and also liquor ads, and of course, tobacco ads. So he's talking about, I don't know that this really helped. I mean, it may have helped that particular generation, but I still see a lot of people, especially students on campus, still smoking. Although we're in a smoke-free campus, but you can tell when somebody's had a cigarette. Okay. Oh, Angela Davis. Now, I'm a child of the 60s, and being a child of the 60s, we tend to be somewhat on the activist side. So I grew up watching Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael, all of the Black Panthers, and watching the news and recognizing that they were doing something to help our community. So she's a scholar, activist, author, women's rights person, and civil rights activist, and author of at least several books. But in this case, it was Women, Race, and Class, and Are Prisons Obsolete? This was photographed in 1983 in Detroit, Michigan. And I had traveled with my friend Adolphe Dupree, his girlfriend, and a couple of other people. And again, we were doing work with the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. So we're going into the Amistad series. Let's see, Rosemary, are you there to see if anybody has any questions?
Yes, I'm here. We don't have any questions yet.
So
Do you
far,
want?
okay. Excuse me?
I did want to bring up when you were talking about the collective, there is a exhibition at the Whitney right now that I remember reading about, and I'm a little afraid to go to museums at the moment, but I really want to go, and I haven't yet. Have you gone?
No, I'm in Florida, so I'm
Oh,
really
that's
kind
right.
of social distancing.
Mhm.
But the work is a collection of the original Komongi members from 1963, maybe to the very early 80s. And it was
Mhm.
first premiered at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, who did a 7-week, really, really incredible interview series with current and former Komonge members from that period of time. So as far as I know, that information is on their website, and then the Whitney is also having a couple of interviews with Komonge members. I don't know if their interviews will be as extensive as Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, but Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, because of COVID, ended up having much more time to organize their information. And they really focused it around Lou Draper, who was one of our founding members of Komonge, and they made a beautiful catalog, which at some point, maybe during that 5-minute break, I'll get up and get the book and show you the catalog. So now I'm going into the Amistad series, which was really fascinating to me because I made some really good friends, one of which is Wayne Bartow, which I'll show you Wayne's photograph in a couple of minutes. Wayne was part of Undoing Racism, and I got to meet while employed with Rockland Community College. I was always from day one on African American History Month committee. I mean, that was just like in my heart. So that was just something I had to do. So one year, one of our chairs at the time, Andrea Bythewood, brought this gentleman to campus. His name was Warren Marr. And he was talking about this ship that he was going to build called the Amistad. He was going to do a recreation of the Amistad. So, of course, I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I'm really, really interested. So at the end of the lecture, I got a few minutes to talk to Mr. Marr. And he told me that I should meet Wayne Bartow. Well, sure enough, I got involved with Undoing Racism and met Wayne Bartow. Wayne Bartow happened to be one of the people who was involved with Undoing Racism, so I got a chance to meet him. I want to just preface the series by saying I worked on it from 1999 to 2007. So it was from analog, making that transition into digital. I also want to say that the Amistad is a replica of the ship involved in an 1839 incident where a group of African slaves, they were from Sierra Leone, took control of the ship along the northern coast of Cuba. The fact is, when the ship came over from Africa, it was called the Takora. So now they actually went to the northern, they landed in the southern part of Cuba. They went to the northern part, changed to the Amistad ship. Then they sailed the ship up the coast before being captured by a revenue cutter off of Montauk Point, Long Island. And then the slaves, or the enslaved men, or Sierra Leoneans, were initially brought to New London, Connecticut, then jailed in New Haven before the US Supreme Court ruled that they be set free in 1841. I also add that because I had a question about this during one of my previous lectures, but the Amistad is a Baltimore clipper. So someone asked me, when they built the Amistad, was that used in the Amistad movie by director Steven Spielberg? And it was not. That was a Baltimore clipper that was called the Pride 2. Okay. So this is just a transitional slide, actually made in Cape Cod.
That you must like.
Sorry?
Oh,
Rosemary?
No, it's okay. I think someone accidentally unmuted themselves.
Oh, I see. Okay. So this is actually a photograph. I called it the Amistad, A Struggle for Human Rights, again, from 1999 to 2007. And of course, a lot of the activities happened in Connecticut. So oftentimes I was having to take off of work for different reasons and go to Connecticut and photograph the Amistad activities. So this gentleman on the left is Wayne Bartow. Gentleman on the right is Warren Marr. So Wayne was actually, he's actually a shipwright, so he builds boats, and he was the volunteer coordinator for the Amistad. And we took these photographs, which originally were just color prints, in Warren Marr's home in Valley Cottage, New York. And this is a photograph of Wayne in the belly of the Amistad, and that was taken in 1999 using my medium format Mamiya camera. This is Out of Shed Day, March 15, 2000. So of course, any activities that were going on, I had to keep on my calendar in case I needed to be there for very specific days of when the Amistad was having. So they were on a very tight, production schedule. Now this is Out of Shed Day, 10 days later, March 25th, 2000 in Mystic Seaport. So that was actually where the Amistad was built. And I just want to point out on the bottom of the picture here is Wayne Bartow, and also a very patient gentleman named Quentin Snedeker. He was the project director for the Amistad America. This is Wayne in Bridgeport, Connecticut for what they call one of their homecoming events, and that was July 2006. So the Amistad was actually about another 10 feet longer than the original Baltimore Clipper. And what they did was they put an engine in the boat, and then it was like extra, space for storage and traveling and, and that sort of thing. So they had to accommodate the boat by adding another 10 feet. This is the Amistad ceremony to honor the Sierra Leoneans, and this is in New Haven, Connecticut. So I did not know Connecticut very well, and of course this is before GPS days. So it was interesting. Somehow I managed to get there to photograph and to get back home to Spring Valley and get to work the next day. Warren Marr. Around two very creative brothers who were twins. They were the McLeod twins. And I just sort of added this recently because I thought it was important to show, Warren Marr and, his involvement. He's in a wheelchair, of course, by this time. And you can see the bottom of the Amistad here. And this is a send-off for the Amistad and crew. They're about to make a tour through Sierra Leone. And it was sort of like a worldwide tour. And I don't have sea legs, so I never really actually sailed on the vessel. But this gentleman, I really want to give kudos to him. His name is Donald George. And he came from Sierra Leone. He's holding their flag. Those are their colors. And he just volunteered. He didn't have any money. I don't believe he even had citizenship, American citizenship. So it was very difficult, but he was so committed to the project of building the Amistad and having her travel the world as an international educational institution. This is Captain Bill Pickney. He was one of the many sailors who sailed the Amistad schooner. In this case, he took her to Sierra Leone. There were a number of captains who made different trips. It's really an interesting profession. It's a very interesting profession working on the sea. We brought the Amistad. A number of organizations coordinated in Rockland County to bring the Amistad to Haverstraw twice. I don't have the exact years in front of me, but the lady to the left here is Drusilla Kinzonzi, who's currently either chair or co-chair of the African American Historical Society of Rockland County. And then this young man is a drummer. Um, So it's important to say that Amistad America International or Incorporated is a national nonprofit educational organization whose mission was to promote reconciliation and harmony among races through ownership and operation of the Freedom Schooner Amistad. And it ports nationally and internationally as an ambassador for freedom and goodwill. And one of the huge things that we try to do when organizing Amistad activities was to invite the schools and to go into the schools and actually have the schools come down as a field trip and view the boat, and they would learn about African American history. And that was so important. You know, it was such an important mission. And that was also one of the things. We'd have committees, and Wileen Wood, President Wood's wife, was very active in organizing. And I remember the second time we were trying to bring the Amistad to Rockland County was a little after 9/11. And with that in mind, you know, everybody was so depressed at that period of time that we just decided to wait until things were better. Plus, you know, the economy was drying up and we didn't really have money to sponsor and make the, you know, the educational materials the way we would have wanted to. But it was a beautiful thing because it brought really so many cultures together. And as I teach my classes at Rockland Community College, I'll mention this and I'll have my students say to me, "Oh, I remember visiting the Amistad when I was a little kid." And I just love it because, you know, they were paying attention and it really made a difference in their lives. And I mean, today there's still discussions about African American history being taught during this month. And it's really something that should be taught all year round. African American history is American history. There is no doubt about it. This is Halifax, Nova Scotia, which I actually flew to, traveling with Wayne Bartow. We flew to Halifax, and I was particularly excited to be in Halifax because I was always told that some of my Fournier family passed through there. I don't know if that's, I don't know. But there were a lot of Creole people who lived in Halifax and Nova Scotia territory. So this young man was part of a program called the Sankofa Sail Program. And I'll show you a few more photographs of some of the young people who were involved. You could also see this young man here. Oh, I'm sorry. Very sensitive mouse. This young man here was also part of the program, and they were learning shipwriting skills and experiencing maritime life on the seas. So this is a photograph I call Sankofa 6. You can see the Canadian flag since we're in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the young men are, the young men of color are from, I believe, New Haven Sound School in New Haven, Connecticut, and the other young men, the young white men, are Canadian. So what they would do is they would have a program where they would have the young people work amongst themselves. And I just thought that was really excellent. So it was absolutely worth, you know, documenting, showing them working together. So this particular part gets a little wordy, but one of the functions of the Amistad, in addition to its journey to Halifax, Nova Scotia, was to support the Black community in Nova Scotia in a little community called Africville. And Africville was a very fascinating place. I would love to go there. I even became one of their, not an honorary member, but one of their paid members of their, you know, community, because I was just so impressed with Africville in Canada. So this trip to Nova Scotia celebrated the Black Cultural Society of Nova Scotia's Genealogy Society Church Committee's 23rd annual church service. I actually have to read that because it's too much to say. And now the interesting thing about Africville, first of all, during slavery times and Reconstruction, in that period after slavery, many of the slaves who made it north continued to go north. And if they stayed on the East Coast, they ended up in Africa. That was one of the most northern parts of Canada, where you found a Black free community that was starting to build and grow. So that's, part of the history of Africville. So, again, I'm photographing a woman dancing, and there are the drums in the background. Everybody spoke English, some French, but for the most part, everybody spoke English. So we were able to, really communicate with one another. Okay, another part of the church service. This church service must have gone about 4 or 5 hours. So another part of the church service. And these are sisters from Sierra Leone. In the background, you see the A. Murray McKay Bridge. This is a park that's called Seaview Park. And this was on the last day of their ceremony of their 23rd annual church service. What was very significant about this land is that in the 1960s, the land was gentrified. The community of Africville was kicked off their land by the Canadian government to build the bridge that you see in the background, and also this park that they call Seaview Park. And all during our touring of the Amistad between different locations, there was this one gentleman, I think he was either maybe 40s or 50s. He was on a bicycle, and he just kept ranting and raving about how the Canadian government stole their land. And it was very sad. It was very sad. And in doing my studying, I found out that, well, I even experienced it, that a lot of parts of Black communities were decimated, or highways were built through. New Orleans, DC, a couple of other places, highways, Rochester, New York, definitely. It became like one part, 14608. I'll never forget that. Cornhill became like a gentrified area. The highway was right next to it, and on the other side of that was the Black neighborhood. And by the time it became Cornhill, some Blacks were able to hold onto their property, but not everyone. Not everyone. So the Canadian government eventually did apologize to the community of Africville for, industrialization, I don't know, and gentrification. I don't know really what else to call it. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of a break. Are there any questions so far? Rosemary, how we doing?
We're doing well. We don't have any questions in the chat. I was just curious, like when you take street photos.
Wait, can you hold on just a second? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Lex, I'm in a presentation.
Okay, all right.
I'll talk to you.
later
All right,
then.
bye-bye, sweetie. That was my sister. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. When you take street photos or photos that aren't composed or posed beforehand, how do you work your way into gaining people's trust? Or do you just ask people outright if they don't mind being photographed? Like,
Yeah, that's really tricky, and I think working for newspapers really helped you to, because I'm actually basically sort of a shy person. I mean, most people don't know that, but maybe some people do. So I think just, being on deadlines, working for the newspaper, you had to just jump in there. You know, you had to come back with footage, you know, you had to come back with photographs. So you just sort of jumped in there. Um, and I'm just really afraid that the shyness is coming back. And, you know, I really, at this point, I feel like my eye is getting stronger and better, and I see more. And I don't want to lose that aggression, you know, that aggressiveness of taking photographs. You know, plus I think you have to have a fairly decent personality. You have to have you have to really love people, you know, even if you can't always tell that they love you back. um,
True.
but I think you really have to, you know, be a people person. That really helps. If you have a bad personality, you're not gonna get all that far in this field, because it is so people oriented, unless you're just doing a fine art, visual art, not using, you know, any people. But I think you just sort of have to jump in there. You know, you just get in there, you tell them what you're doing. I mean, you know, oftentimes I'll just have to say I'm a photographer, and that always catches their eye because so many people are into photography, especially today. Um, and can I photograph you? You know, they'll say yes, they'll say no. The danger in that a little bit is that oftentimes you miss the shot. So that's why you just sort of go in, get the shot, take a couple more, talk to them some more, and then maybe you can get like a few more shots.
Yeah, because you don't want them, you're attracted to them because they're being natural, and then once you start talking, it's like they want to, you know, put on the mask, sort of, I guess, is what
The
I'm
guard
thinking.
goes up. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So
We did.
it's a job, you know, it's a
Yeah.
lifelong job.
Uh, we just had one comment also about the particular image that's up right now. Deborah Donato says she loves this
My
image, the
cousin.
women talking to each other. That's
Yeah,
very natural.
yeah. These women were from Sierra Leone. And one other thing I just wanted to um, mention about the Amistad, it was under construction. First of all, it's 129 feet. It's a schooner. It's what they call a Baltimore Clipper. It was under construction for 30 months, so a little bit over a year. The ship's design, as I mentioned, is historically accurate, yet there was an additional 10 feet added to make room for plumbing and electricity on board. The Amistad was built by 125 people and symbolizes struggle for equality and human rights. When the 100-foot mast, engine, and beams were added to the Baltimore Clipper, she weighed 96 tons. So I just always thought that was interesting.
Wow. Okay, everyone, we're just going to take like a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back for the second half of Colette's presentation.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Rosemary.
Yes.
Hi, I'm back.
Okay. All right. Colette is back. We're going to start with section 3.
Okay. Um, all right, this is an image that I made sometime in the 90s. You know, sometimes you kind of lose track, so that's why it's important to really write everything so you can really see. But I took this image because my mother, we were in Macy's one day. I was, you know, visiting the city, and my mother pointed out to me that she saw a homeless woman in Macy's washing, and she was so appalled by the fact that she saw this homeless woman. And I can't remember if it was the same day or what, but you know, usually wherever I was carrying a camera, and I was around Port Authority, 42nd Street, where a lot of times you would see a lot of homeless people. And I saw this woman, I took the image, and I just, you know, thought it was just really fascinating. I didn't want to show her full body or her head because I thought just photographing her was kind of um, you know, just sort of getting into invading her privacy. So I just composed it the way I did. But what we're going into now is post Hurricane Katrina series. So this is a photograph of me. I'm in the 17th ward in post Hurricane Katrina, and actually what had happened was Kamonge drew up a proposal. I think we actually hired a writer, a grant writer, and we had a grant written to help subsidize trips down to the Gulf Coast area to photograph post-Hurricane Katrina. So this is actually 18 months later in 2007, April 2007. And I was able to get a couple of weeks off with, you know, vacation time. I was able to take a couple of weeks off and go down and photograph. And I'll just kind of get into it. So I really consider this to be like really one of my best assignments because it was just totally up to me. You know, I envisioned what I wanted to photograph. Excuse me, of course, until you actually get on a site or the scene of something, you don't quite know what you're going to photograph. But I had an idea in mind that I wanted to show that things were actually getting better. New Orleans is one of my favorite cities in life. And I really wanted to show that she was coming back, or at least start to talk about some of the problems that the city was facing after Hurricane Katrina. So I met a young woman named Ann Gaines, who we'll see a photograph of, and she happened to be a cousin of some people in Spring Valley, some people that I know in Spring Valley. And I was sitting in on a class that sort of met in the round, and I mentioned my interest in going to photograph New Orleans in, you know, the next couple of months. And a gentleman stepped up who turned out to be Ann Gaines's cousin. He's sadly passed now, but he said, "Oh, I have a cousin there, and she'll just take you around and show you around." So this is one of the early scenes that I photographed. There were no street signs, so you couldn't quite see where you were. You just had to make mental notes in your mind as to what street you were on. Some people like had hand lettered streets, hand lettering just papers or signage. And the fellow that you see back here in the red truck, he's a contractor. And what I've certainly learned is that during all of these storms, so many of the contractors rip people off, and it's just so horrible. You know, it's really, anyway, So this is, his purpose there was to come and try to start fixing up one of these houses. But oftentimes what would happen is that the people would pay money, the contractors would do a little bit of work, and then they would skip town. This is a photograph of the levees in Louisiana, the 17th Street Canal, which at this point, I guess it had overflowed. But I just thought this was interesting because all my life, since the time I was a little girl, I would hear these blues songs about the levees. And it's like, I got to see what these levees look like. But just the fact that they're going in and they're looking rusted already, it's like, that wasn't a good sign to me. This is Sister's Place in the lower Ninth Ward, and I really kind of like the composition. Having an appreciation for science, I looked at this vehicle down here, and I called it. I said, this is entropy. This is what entropy means. So people will understand that as soon as they see the rusted car. I love the use of line, because line helps to show direction, as to where your eye, you're trying to lead your person. But you can see that the neighborhood is just very overgrown, and very few people are living there in the lower Ninth Ward in April of 2007. I photographed Miss Carletha. I met her through Ann Gaines. And one of the issues that I kept hearing about Hurricane Katrina's stories was the fact that each of the trailers that people had only had 2 keys. And if you had a family of like 5, 6, 7 people, and you only had 1 key, that just didn't really work. But the other thing you can see is that the trailer, and what they would do is they would just park the trailer right outside the person's home. So the person would still have access to their home if there was anything of value left in the home. But you can see it's like dark and dingy, and most of the trailers were not in good shape at all. As I'm sitting talking to Miss Carletha, and I'm usually audio taping as well as photographing, a hurricane or a tornado warning comes over the television. So you can see that the newscaster here is talking about it, and we are in a trailer which has no foundation. And I said, well, if worse comes to worse, maybe my camera equipment will weigh me down. I won't get blown away. But that was kind of a scary moment for me, that I'm not used to tornadoes, although we have had a tornado or 2 in Rockland County. But, again, you could see just the condition, again, very, very dark, and a place to live, very temporary housing. And I just thought this was kind of an interesting photograph, garbage collector, showing that life was sort of coming back to normal. And this is the French Quarter, so you can see there are a lot of tourists here, who are through the versus, this guy who's like an essential worker. And again, the beauty about the shoot was that I just got to spend a lot of time talking to people, and I really valued that experience. So this is a gentleman, Tyrone, and he was telling me that when Hurricane Katrina hit, he went north to, I think it was Newark, New Jersey. I believe it was Newark, New Jersey. So he was showing me his New Jersey license, because he had to get a license. But anyway, he got a job. He was able to get a job selling Christmas trees, and he was happy to get the job. And then, of course, he did come back to New Orleans, because that became a big issue where people were just talking about not coming back. They were so tired of the hurricanes and the flooding, and this was such a catastrophe, national catastrophe. This is a woman, I call this photograph Miss Annie of Creole Gardens, and she worked at the bed and breakfast where I stayed. So that was the very first best bed and breakfast that I ever stayed at. And she did everything. She did the cooking, she did the cleaning, she washed clothes. I think maybe there was like one other quote unquote sort of maid there, but she did, most of keeping this place together. She was there for about 9 or 10 years already. And she told me she lived in the projects, and when Hurricane Katrina hit, she was sent to um, the the Super Bowl where everybody else was set. Okay. And that she said she would never step her foot in that arena again. She said it was just so devastating, and the filth and people and bodies floating. She said she would just never go there again. And now I think Mercedes Benz or BMW now own that arena. These are two ladies, three ladies actually, that are in a health clinic in the lower Ninth Ward on St. Claude Street. And there was a woman who owned this house, and she took half of her house and created a health clinic. So those were the kind of stories that I was looking for. And these women are part of, I think they called it like ARP, some kind of like 55 plus program, where they became clerks, and they assisted with medical files. So it gave them work. But I just thought it was such a beautiful thing that this woman, whose photograph I have and I should include in the presentation, because that was just a valiant thing for her to do, was to give up half of her home for it to become a medical center. This is Ringo, and the X codes is what I call it. And he was kind of an interesting character, and I spent some time talking to him. He was a retiree from the Air Force, and right now he's about to water plants. You can see that the church is still boarded up, so they weren't even, open yet after that, 18 months. And he was going to be working with a group of University of Colorado architecture students and the Army Corps of Engineers to produce new bayous where tourists can fish. And then, of course, you see the X codes on the outside of the building. This is Anne Gaines. And part of her story was that she had to raise her home. It was sitting under 10 feet of water, her house and her garage, and everything was just full of mold. So she just decided to raise her home. She was a nurse, and I'm so sorry. So her husband is a nurse, and we'll see a picture of Daryl in just a minute. She was a CPA, and so she still had a job, but she ended up moving to the western part of Louisiana. Right now, she lived in New Orleans East. And this is Anne again, and you can see some of the damage on her computer of what her house looked like. This, I believe, is her mom, and I don't remember who this lady was, but they're right now in her mother's home, because right now she and her husband were homeless, so her mother said, "We'll just come and live with us." And this is her and Daryl, Anne and her husband Daryl. So they're in Lake Charles, Louisiana. So I purposely really tried to underexpose this, didn't use any flash, any kind of fill flash. I wanted to get as much of the map. I didn't want the map to be washed out, so I really wanted to get as much of the map. And they're just trying to show me where the actual levees had broken. And I just take my hat off to this lady. She's Leah Hodges. She's a community activist, and she's part of Common Cause. And many days she got very little to eat. This is like a common scene where she's just always on the phone trying to reach out to her clients. Many people at this point in time had a lot of mental issues, and she was trying to just talk to them, calm them down and tell them that there's going to be hope if you just kind of hang in there. This is a restaurant, sort of restaurant in the background that was not open. So oftentimes there were not a lot of places open where you could get food and, things to eat, water and such. But one of the things that she did, Leah Hodges, she testified to Congress that Katrina victims died from racism and abject neglect. And for me, she defined the human spirit of survival. This is Mike from the lower Ninth Ward, and I believe this is his house here, or the one next to it. I think the white one here is his house. You can see he's got on a New Orleans Saints t-shirt, and he was just pouring his heart out to me. Oftentimes, you know, just little subtle things you sort of notice in photographs, but oftentimes you'll notice sort of like black on some of the people's skin. In some cases, it was mold. We talked for a very long time, and we were talking to his sister-in-law, and she had actual mold growing on her leg. I mean, I don't know how you get rid of that, but she had mold growing on her leg. And his story was that his son used to live around the corner, but after Hurricane Katrina, he had no idea where his son was. So, you know, people just got lost and were presumed, you know, dead. This is my friend Gerard Mouton, very, very good friend of mine. I studied photography with at RIT as an undergrad. And he's showing me his mother's house in Gentilly. You know, so like a lot of cities, New Orleans had a lot of crime. And you can see somebody tried to bust, you know, break the window. And he just would always go by his mother's house and just check. She wasn't living there. They actually found housing someplace else in the city. But he would just always go by and check on his mother's property. And he also gave me a lot of, you know, if I got stuck for ideas or places to go, I would call Moo and he would say, oh, Fournier, you can check this out, or Fournier, you can talk to this person. Maybe they can kind of help you with, you know, generate some ideas. So you saw a lot of this. This is Easter Sunday, so this is my last day in New Orleans. Claiborne Street, Stop the Killing, Thou Shalt Not Kill. And this particular house was for sale. Again, I love that use of line. I love the use of texture and working with my wide angle lens. And these are 4 young men who were running for the Chase campaign. And, you know, again, it's the African-American community, and you see the bear ads. But 2 of them were 10th grade students, 2 of them were in college at Dillard, and they were working for the Chase campaign to bring about changes in New Orleans. This is a view onto St. Augustine's Church, and you can see the Blackstreet Cultural Museum. Sorry. These were very, very dear friends from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, based in New Orleans. And I would say originally, their building was flooded out, so that they had to find another building to operate out of. And this is Dr. Richards, Kimberly Richards, who was the head of the organization. And then this is Ron Chisholm. And I met these folks who did a lot of undoing racism training. They would oftentimes come to Rockland County, which was a base for undoing racism, especially in Nyack and Spring Valley. So they became, you know, a good place to talk to people about what had happened. And they turned me on to this very dynamic woman named Miss Alma Watkins. Can you hold on just a second? And it was just very interesting to me, because everybody that I met in Louisiana, just about everybody had some kind of piece of property. And not only did, in fact, the mayor, Nagin, had a piece of property also in Houston, Texas. So a lot of people had property not only in New Orleans and in some cases Lake Charles, but also in Houston, Texas. Which to me was a really good thing. I really liked the fact that that a lot of people had that sense of ownership and property ownership. That was very, very important to me. But Miss Alma Watkins, Miss Alma to the left here, is actually on the phone organizing for a rally the next day. And then this is her mom, who's just sort of looking through old albums, reminiscing, times before Hurricane Katrina. This is Miss Alma's son, Stephen Watkins, and he had MS, and he had MS since the time he was in his first or second year of college. So he really needed 24-hour care, which he was able to get, but she really fought for him to get him the help, the right health aides, et cetera, et cetera. She really fought for him. And this is kind of a signature shot of Miss Alma's mother, who again, they're in Algiers, which is the western part of New Orleans. And she's on her way. She's like 90 something and she looks like so cool. But she's on her way to a daycare program that she went to every day. Okay, so this is the last of that series. Were there any questions or comments to be shared?
We didn't have any questions. I was just really struck by this photograph and the one of Miss Alma's mom. Yeah, that one is so fantastic. I mean, they're all fantastic, but just the expression on the two women's faces is just amazing.
And you can really see, and the interesting thing also about Miss Alma, she was like in that sandwich generation. So she's taking care of her mom, plus she's taking care of her son that has a disability. And of course, when Hurricane Katrina hit, all hell broke loose relative to his disability, because they had to basically drive in one car. They all went to, I believe, Houston. And for days, they couldn't find her son, who was, in a disability vehicle. And it was terrible. It was really crazy. The cell service was out. There wasn't a whole lot of cell service anyway, but they had a very, very difficult time, finding him. But, you can kind of see that she's very Afrocentric, and, mom is like more like, Sunday go to meeting kind of, dress. But yeah, so it was very, very, very interesting photo session. And I probably spent about 2 days with them. And that's what happens sometimes. You just really get kind of involved in the story and you want to capture as much of it as you can.
Yeah, we had a question about this photo that's up right now. Is that the effect? Is that because you're in a car and you're taking the picture?
Yes. Yeah. It is because I'm in a car and I'm taking the picture. And it had rained, I think, the night before, of course, which was very normal for, New Orleans to have very rainy weather.
It's so perfect. It's such a perfect frame. Wow.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah.
And these little things up front are they I think they're sort of like, she called them sort of like good luck little charms that everybody throws around during Mardi Gras time. In fact, from what I understand, there's no Mardi Gras again this year. And of course, last year when there was Mardi Gras, there was a lot of spreading of COVID because it just sort of hit at that time before people were aware of what was going on. Okay. All right, so I'm into my final few photographs, and this is travels to West Africa from 2007 to 2010. Let's see, so right now we're in Benin. I actually traveled with my dance group. I dance and drum with Chico Awali, African dance and drum culture. And we did 3 trips to West Africa, specifically to Ghana. Our I don't know if you want to call it well, she became a queen mother, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But our queen mother and the head of Chico Awali, Miss Alexandrina Dixon, traced her lineage back to Ghana. And we actually had a young man that was from Ghana who was working for us and drumming with us. And he came to the United States with his wife, and they had a little baby, a son, who was born in the US. And then he actually had to go back to Africa. When he went back to Africa and attempted to come back to the US, they would not let him in. So this is a community. I see Bert. Hi, Bert. This is a community of about 20,000 people who live on the water. And for me, this was absolutely so fascinating to see people just living and operating their daily lives on the water. It's just amazing. And these were children welcoming tourists and greeting them with song. And you could see they have some of the white powder on them, which is for protection. And what's so interesting to me culturally is that when I was a kid, and actually I still actually do this with my hair, this is how our mother used to do her hair after she washed it. She would just make it into these little what we call rolls, and because she would have to comb out each section. And so to see the little girl with the little rolls in her hair was so precious and kind of took me back to a moment in time. But you can see I used a little flash. There was a lot of very bright, soft light, but there was a lot of very bright light coming into the camera. So I needed just a little flash to make sure that I didn't underexpose them. And you can see the flash in their eyes. So it's just one lighting source. Again, we're still in the water village of Ganvi, Benin. And you know, you can see how the people live just with their homes on stilts. And everybody, you know, probably the whole village knows how to swim. I mean, that was, if you live on water, you better know how to swim. You know. And people were very friendly. They really depended upon tourism. So this was kind of an interesting shot. So we're in on the Atlantic coast in Ghana. I was so excited to get the shot that my horizon line is not the best, to be very honest. But what I loved about the shot, it was just so interesting to me, like how people make a living, how people find a way to eke out a living. And these young men did that by giving people rides on these emaciated horses. But what really kind of pulled me into the photograph was the young man with the orange shirt and that reflection underneath. And, you know, also the body language and the waves of the water. You know, I just thought that all of the components came together. And this is the same beach 3 years later during sunset. So the exact same beach, but 3 years later, and I call that horseshoes. So here we're still in Ghana. We're on a bus, and I just made this image. We had stopped, and you know, again, people are just making money any way they can, selling potatoes, eggs, pencils. You know, you could see here the baby on the lady's back. And this is actually a public restroom where we stopped, where you actually had to pay to use the restroom. And they had someone that you could, that would come behind and make sure that the restroom was clean since you had to pay for it. This is Elmina Castle. So at this point, it was my second visit to Elmina Castle. And you know, this was the castle, this was one of the castles along the coast of, you know, what they call the Gold Coast, where slaves were, I guess, sequestered or, you know, kept in slavery. This is always hard to talk about whenever we come to this part with Elmina Castle. I love the architecture of the building. I thought the architecture was so very unique. I like to show scale. I really like to show scale. So I sort of waited for the guy to walk into the scene. And actually I heard him. I heard him coming. I didn't see him, but I heard him. So I knew somebody was going to walk through that pathway. the interesting thing that they said, so many people had owned. It was a trading post for the Portuguese from 1482 to 1637, and then the Dutch owned it from 1637 to 1872, and then I believe the British came next. But when they see that, you see like any kind of gold coloring bricks, that was during the time that the Dutch owned Elmina Castle. Oh, sorry. This was a holding cell for male slaves, and I think it held maybe about 500 people. It kind of smelled as bad as it looked. It was very damp and dank and very musty. And I just used a flash, just one flash, really lit up that wall so that you can see some of the detail. This was a slave camp in the northern part of Ghana, closer to the Burkina Faso border. And when I'm doing like a live lecture, I always ask people, can they guess what these shapes are from? And actually I can, what they are from is just years of the slaves sort of digging into this granite. And of course, when it rained, it collected water so they could sort of drink from these sort of self-made dishes. And then they could also put food in there and eat food from the stone granite. This is an area called Asim Manso, and it was an area called Three Rivers. So actually 3 rivers would meet here. And this is an area where they would bring the slaves. Well, one of the things that I did not share with you, which is sort of key to my journeys to West Africa, was that when I was about 4, 5, or 6, I don't remember exactly, my sister and I were watching Uncle Tom's Cabin, $1 Million movie. And some of you would remember $1 Million movie, but it was a series on Channel 9, a series of films that they would run 7 nights a week. And every night they would show the same film from maybe 9 to 11. And when we were watching Uncle Tom's Cabin, I inquired why he was being treated so mean. And my sister just kind of blurted out. She's about 3.5 years older than me, I'm sorry. And she just kind of blurted out, well, we were once slaves. I mean, she just sort of told that to me. And I was just like shocked because I knew what a slave was. I couldn't imagine that we as Black people and African-American people were once slaves. And, of course, I was young enough to not know that kind of history. And my grandparents, who were from Guyana, Georgetown and Demerara, Guyana, they didn't personally experience slavery, but they knew that there was slavery in Guyana, and they simply never talked about it. They just came to the United States, they got their citizenship, they came through Ellis Island, they became hardworking people, established their families. My grandfather got into real estate, buying, several properties in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Bed-Stuy as we call it, and they just simply never talked about the history. Only one of my cousins, who's now passed, would go back every winter to Guyana. So it's just, really interesting how, and I find that talking to a lot of people, like in my particular age group, and no matter what their background, their people never really talked about where they came from. Sometimes they didn't. Of course, you would see that they would bring their traditions along with them, food, clothing, cooking, expressions, but they didn't. When things were bad, they didn't talk about it. I love this photograph because it again, it gives scale, but it's an ancestral shrine, and it really pays homage to much of that slavery experience in Africa. What's also significant about it is that it's supposed to be a place, an ancestral altar where you can go and pay homage to um, your constructing memories. So you can go and kind of say prayers to your ancestors. And what was so impressive to me was that wherever you went, at least wherever we went in West Africa, there were always places that showed the history that never, so in other words, we're not going to forget that we were once enslaved. You know, although in further studies, I start to understand that it was sort of a commercial venture on the parts of some tribes. Because I remember hearing a story from some women in Senegal who were part of, they were like kings and queens and daughters of kings and queens. And they got access to some of their archives from around the time of slavery. And they actually had lists and lists and lists of people's names who became slaves. You know, some of them, like somebody like Kunta Kinte, his slavery was accidental. He just happened to be in the wrong place in the wrong time, you know, hunting. But in some cases, they were actually pre-planned that, you know, we're having this war going on, you lost the war, and so many of your people are going to be enslaved and sent to wherever, you know, bought by the Europeans. And you're going to go to a foreign land. I mean, people didn't even know what was going on. All right, I have to watch my time. So I'm just about to the end. So this is the making of I call it trotting to a Queen Mother ceremony. It's in Betpoise, Ghana. And we did a lot of work with the community in Betpoise. And this is actually Miss Drina, the lady in the middle in the black Kente material. And she's going to become a Queen Mother of Progress. So I spent a lot of time photographing her becoming a Queen Mother. It was about like a 4-hour ceremony, a lot of dancing, drumming, protection. They would actually change her clothing. And that's really the last slide. So this is my information in case anybody has any more questions. Hello, Veronica. And thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate it. I always like to give thanks to Arts Council of Rockland, who've been so very supportive. Finkelstein, Nyack Library, the libraries have been very, very supportive of my work over the years. A very nice gentleman, Leonard Kurz, who also helped to finance a number of these productions, which I've been able to share, you know, over the years. So if you have any other questions, please ask them. This is the time. I think I went over just a little bit, so I apologize for that. Oh, you guys can unmute yourselves, or Rosemary.
Yeah, I was going to say you can unmute yourselves and turn on your cameras if you want to.
Colette.
Hi, Bird. How are
Colette.
you?
Oh, you know it's me. I don't see my face. You can see me? What are you doing in Florida?
I'm trying to get back to New York.
I mean, does it have to do with COVID or anything?
Well, yeah, I was social distancing, and then I had a couple of little medical issues, so that kept me here longer, and you know, physical therapy. But
So
you know, while I'm here, I'm making images with my little iPhone camera, so I'm very happy to, you know, be in.
Great. How long are you down there?
A little over a year.
And how long you intend staying?
Well, right now I took the auto train down, and I'm supposed to travel back around the very last week of April. So-
Okay,
So wish me luck.
okay. You know, up here with the pandemic and everything, everything's changed. You know, I was always at all your shows and everything, and everybody else's, and I was just about everywhere. Now I'm nowhere.
It's
The only thing that's
crazy.
saving me are these Zoom things. I do
Yeah,
about 6 Zooms a week, all the libraries and everything.
easily.
I wasn't able